Hello and welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing. Obviously in partnership with the Sunderland Farm Museum, we're also in partnership with Cospex Opticians in Durham. I'm joined this morning by Dom Shaw. How are you doing, Dom?
I'm all right, mate. Yourself? Quiet couple of days?
Yeah, I think I'm ready for a lie down for about 3 or 4 days. It's just been a bit chaotic, hasn't it, from start to finish? Before we get into all of that, obviously you can subscribe to We Are Sunderland. It's £1 for just 6 months worth of subscription. If you subscribe at the minute, you can win a signed Sunderland shirt from the Papa John's Trophy final in 2021. So a bit of a collector's item there for you. Well, I suppose there can only be one place to sort of start and move things on. Obviously, we had an emergency sort of video go live on the day Michael Beale was set to be sacked. He has now obviously been sacked. Just some thoughts from yourself, Dom, on the situation as a whole.
Well, when you said they're chaotic, that doesn't just apply for the last couple of days. I think that applies from the minute Tony Mowbray was sacked, certainly from the minute Michael Beale was appointed. Beale didn't help himself, did he? It goes without saying that Beale didn't help himself, and that whole incident at the weekend just felt like another thing off the pitch that he could have done without. And there was various examples of that over the period that he was in charge of Sunderland. Obviously, the pre-Stoke press conference, that Stoke game, and then the Plymouth game, the second half of the Plymouth game was so impressive. And we talked afterwards about how Beale in his press conference after the game looked visibly more relaxed. He looked like he was maybe settling a little bit, and then obviously 2 poor, damaging defeats the week after, and all of the rest that came with it again off the pitch. And it felt like accepting that. I think, fair play to Sunderland for holding their hands up and accepting that they got it wrong. It was a bad appointment. We've said it before, haven't we, on here? It always felt to me with Beale, and I think last week was proof, really. He was always going to be 1 or 2 defeats away from having to answer difficult questions again. He could have won 3 or 4 on the bounce, and then 1 or 2 defeats, he'd have to answer difficult questions again. I think in Mike Dodds, they've got a real steady hand from now until the end of the season. I think Dodds will see this as a chance for him to basically a longer term audition for him to get the job, which I'm sure we'll get onto. And we'll get onto this, I'm sure. I think Beale is how can I put it? I think he's better off away from it for now, because when I don't think it was healthy for him. He was on his own at Sunderland. He came without coaching staff. He clearly wasn't capable of not kind of putting his foot in it in press conferences, unless it was purposeful. I don't know, the stuff about the accent, for example, a couple of weeks back, that felt like that's not something you just drop in. I think the stress and the strain of the job was clearly taking its toll, and I think it suits all parties and benefits all parties, really, for him to be for the change to be made.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think obviously on a personal side of things, part of me feels sorry for Beale. Just obviously everything he's got going on in the background with his family, you wouldn't wish that upon anybody. As you say, though, aside from that, back on the football side of things, he hasn't done himself any favours. I think if you go back to the very start of his Sunderland sort of appointment, I feel like obviously he's had a brief period out of the game. So this is just my personal thoughts, obviously, the situation as a whole. I feel like he's come into Sunderland with, a lot. The Rangers situation, I don't think he maybe fully got over that. I feel like he's come in wanting to prove a point at Sunderland, and it probably wasn't the right time. I know loads of people have said wrong person, wrong time. There's no doubt he's a good coach. It's well documented. Steven Gerrard said, if I was as good a coach as Michael Beale, etc. It just felt it felt wrong from the outset, didn't it? And I think, as you say, I think it's there was times where Michael Beale was sat in front of him in press conferences, and he felt like he had a real guard up. As you say, there was a period where he was a little bit more relaxed, but it felt like he was just fighting fire. Some of those his own doing, some of those, just like the Derby debacle, everything like that. But it was the Stoke City press conference that really, I think, was starting to spell the beginning of the end, wasn't it? Like that was just.
Yeah, because I think getting rid of Mowbray was an unpopular decision on the whole in itself, wasn't it? And I think the acceptance or the general feeling with that was, I don't know what you think, was that if they're going to sack Mowbray, they must have something up the sleeve. They must have, and if someone like a Will Still, for example, someone who maybe, let's not pretend Will Still's reinvented the wheel, but he'd be an exciting appointment. Now, nothing against Beale, but I think because of that general feeling, the appointment of Beale felt to me underwhelming at the time, and I think that was the general consensus. Now, Sunderland fans will give anyone a chance, won't they? They ultimately want to support the team, but for all. Beale would point to the stats of points and wins, and that was okay. What trusting your eyes and what you saw in front of you, it wasn't as exciting as what it had been, was it? When I watched that Middlesbrough Sunderland derby game, for example, what stood out to me was how far behind both teams were compared to this time last year, and that Plymouth game, in the second half of that Plymouth game, you thought, right, that was blistering at times. They were unplayable, weren't they? And you think if we can see that on a regular basis, then Sunderland can and will beat anyone in this league. But promotion, the top six went from being, I don't know whether you'd say it was a probability to a possibility. Probably more so, it went from being a possibility to extremely unlikely. In the last week, you looked at it and just thought, this Sunderland team at the minute aren't capable of the consistency that will be required to move into the top, to get into the top six and stay there. But for me, I think if you're not going to get in the top six this year, you need to say you finish 7th or 8th, but there's a real building blocks and real encouragement for next year. You can take that, can't you? Fans will obviously take that. Was that going to be the case, or was it just constantly going to be a case of Beale putting out fires, some of which he had nothing to do with, and others which he started himself?
Yeah, I think there's plenty there to talk about that you brought up. I mean, on the style of play, it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's a 63 days, it's a 2-month spell. They were a tighter unit, but at the same time, to what degree did that hamper them at the other end? We didn't really see the front foot football that Sunderland have been, accustomed to. Now, when Beale came through the door, it was the sort of suggestion put across in his press conference along with Christian Speakman was, it doesn't matter who is in charge, because in theory, the philosophy we have is to play attacking front foot football, and the quality of the young players we have will come through, and we'll see that anyway. But to go from that to then it not happening, then all of a sudden you sat there thinking, well, is that a way? Is that an approach that can actually work? And then to move it on, as you say, it was just the inconsistencies of it all. That the Plymouth was really good second half, and they have been good. It hasn't been a car crash where they've got beat every week, but it's been just so it's hard to put your finger on and on the pulse of where the problem lies. Is it because there's a lack of experience? Is it because of the man in the dugout? Do the problems stem deeper? Do they go beyond Kewell, etc.? Is there sort of a wider problem that's at the club? And at the minute it's difficult to put your finger on it. As you say, the playoff picture now, especially after the results that just went against Sunderland in midweek, it's 7 points now, I think, isn't it, that they're adrift, and it's just you are looking now at Mike Dodds and thinking that is a hell of a task for him to get them in there. But not only, I agree, it's an audition for Mike Dodds again. It's a longer period of games to assess to see where he's at. But at the same time, if Mike Dodds, if this period of run of games, doesn't work, what then for Mike Dodds? Well, obviously, I put that to him at his press conference. What next for him? Does he stay in a role as assistant coach? Is a new coach going to come in and want to have him working under them, etc.? It's a real strange dynamic behind the scenes as well, I think.
It is, and ultimately, clearly, those above, those who made the decision to appoint Beale, have questions to answer, don't they? Because the decision to get rid of Mowbray was a bold one. We all know that there was issues behind the scenes. We don't need to go over that again. But as I said, the kind of feeling was at the time, well, they must have something up the sleeve. We look back at last season and the manager links Farioli at the end of last season, and the general feeling was, that doesn't mean we're looking to make the change now, but we've got a succession plan in place. We identify managers as we would players. Well, was that the case? Was Michael Beale identified? And again, the question is to be asked now. Now, Mike Dodds might make it impossible for them to appoint anyone else. Mike Dodds might go on a run. Even if Sunderland miss out on the top six, Mike Dodds might go on a run between now and the end of the season where you think, yeah, they're playing really good football. He's got new ideas, creative ideas. The players are responding to him. Let's give him the job. If that doesn't happen, then what Dodds is going to give them now is time to make a decision on an appointment in the summer. And clearly that one has to be right. I always think you can, with like, everyone makes mistakes, don't they, in every industry. Any kind of bad managerial appointment can be excused. You can't afford to make two in a row, can you? You can't afford to make a second slip up. And the next decision, whether it's Dodds or whether someone else comes in, I think is huge for Speakman, especially, probably, and will probably determine kind of how Speakman's time at Sunderland is remembered years and years down the line.
Yeah, I know that we had a couple of comments, obviously, earlier in the week on the day that Beale was sacked about what sort of the future holds for Speakman. I think it's also worth saying, though, that aside from maybe Michael Beale, the managers that they've appointed, they haven't really got a lot wrong, to be honest, have they really? I mean, you can raise questions about Lee Johnson's sides, etc. But the decisions they've made in the past have tended to work. This one, I think, obviously, as you say, it stems back to the Tony Mowbray departure. That's probably the first one managerial decision, anyway, that hasn't worked, because obviously we know the whole summer situation of bringing in signings and transfers, and then leading up to this Michael Beale one. This has just been, pretty catastrophic, hasn't it? 63 days, I think it's the shortest managerial tenure of a permanent manager at Sunderland. It's just the need, as you say, that time from Mike Dodds to make an appointment and make sure it's the right one. There's plenty of questions as well, isn't there, over, I know we spoke about Will Still, one-time target, whether he will be again in the summer. We'll wait and see. It's one of those where Sunderland are at a crossroads, aren't they?
And what you're saying there about Dodds will give him time. That was why the appointment of Beale, and I'm not rewriting history here. I said this at the time. That was why the appointment of Beale surprised me at the time, because it did feel underwhelming. There's no getting away from that. Sunderland were performing well under Dodds. It didn't feel as though, form had fallen off a cliff. We need to get someone in now and kind of keep this season alive, or it's going to get away from us. That absolutely wasn't the case. So Sunderland had time. They had the opportunity to take a step back, to take stock. That surprised me. There's no point going over that now. It'll be interesting, I think, what happens next for Beale, because the obvious question is he going to continue as a manager, or does he go to become a number two? It's easy to forget that you look back to QPR and he was one of the most exciting young managers, isn't it? He turned Wolves down, then he obviously went to Rangers. I think his family was still up there, so that was obviously a chance to get close to his family. Plus Rangers, massive job. Sunderland, huge job. If he wants to stay in management, the next job for him, whether it's months down the line or years down the line, feels huge, doesn't it? Because he couldn't get. I think if that went wrong for him, then that'd probably be it as a manager. Or does he accept? Does he accept? That maybe his strong point might be as a number two, might be as a coach. Does he go back in that way? That'll be interesting to see. But back on Dodds, I thought Dodds was bold when he was in charge, confident. He wasn't afraid to think outside the box with some of his selections. I look back to the way he set up again that Leeds game. Had that backfired, then he'd have been open to criticism there. And really personable as well, considering I wasn't covering the club when he was previously in charge during his caretaker stint, but the guys who were saying that the difference between then when he spoke to the media and this most recent time was startling. And he was open, wasn't he, about how much he'd learned in that time. And he spoke openly about the fact that this recent taste of it did make him realise he wants to go into management at some point. So really, the beauty of having Dodds there is getting rid of Beale. Dodds is a no-brainer to go in. He's a real safe pair of hands, and I mean that in a complimentary rather than just him being a safe appointment. I think there's more to him than that, and I think he'll see this now as a real opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to quickly on Dodds's time when the victory over West Brom, victory over Leeds, even in his press conference after the game, I touched on it the other week. He came out and he said, "Oh, I'm really looking forward to a day off, etc." I played devil's advocate that time and said, is he ready? But on the flip side of things, that's how much energy he put into that role. He gave it his all, and I think you're going to see exactly that again, aren't you? Just in the sort of run between now and the end of the season. On Michael Beale as well, I think you're right. I do think he'll probably have a bit longer out of the game. I think the manner in which he departed, obviously, there was on Monday, I think everyone's well aware of the accusations that were sort of flying around on social media regarding the player ID account. Obviously, We Are Sunderland put that to Michael Beale. We've got a piece on the website about that. So if you want to go and read that, then please do. I do think Michael Beale will have some time out of the game. I do think it'll be important for him. Just given this whole family situation that he's got going on, I know he's obviously really keen to be, in football, and however long you are out of the game, there is a risk of being forgotten. But I think it's clear there he's a good coach, still a young coach. There's plenty, he does have a future in the game, doesn't he? So yeah,
and I, this might have come earlier. Had Sunderland failed to beat Stoke, had Sunderland performed poorly against Stoke in that game, I wouldn't have. The murmurs were, it was put to me from one or two different sources before the game that Beale might well be fighting for his job had they lost that. Now they didn't, and they played well, and then obviously the draw at Middlesbrough and then beat Plymouth, and things change very quickly in football, and then it swings completely the other way with two disappointing defeats against Huddersfield and at the weekend, and I think. In the short term, what last week made clear was Sunderland aren't making the top six as things stand. This Sunderland team are far too inconsistent to make the top six. But then you think beyond that then, don't you? Well, if they're not making the top six this year, are we seeing the shoots, the springboard, basically, the foundations for success that we can build on? Well, it felt like Beale was constantly fighting battles, really, didn't it? Some, as we go back to what we start, some which he had absolutely nothing to do with, and others which he maybe kickstarted himself. So it feels like for the short term and the longer term, this decision just benefits everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this comment through from Marco here. He's upbeat about Saturday. Dodds has got full support, win, lose or draw until the end of the season. And I think that's just the common consensus, isn't it? I think the majority of the Sunderland fan base, they would have been happy with Dodds' appointment had it come 2 months earlier until the end of the season, because there was that acknowledgement that, as you say, Beale's appointment came as a surprise. There was an acknowledgement that, look, if you're getting rid of Tony Mowbray, so highly thought of it at the club and in the eyes of supporters, that you're going to have to get this next managerial appointment right. They didn't. So, is it a waste of 2 months? It's difficult to say, because they were still in touch with the playoffs, but now, as you say, seven adrift. It's an uphill battle. The squad itself, obviously, there's a great core there. They've kept the core from last season. It's going to be a difficult. Behind the scenes, they need to have a succession plan, don't they? Because I think everybody's well aware that Jack Clark will be leaving the club in the summer. I think if they keep hold of him, brilliant. He's not the type of player that's throwing his toys out the pram. And you do have a good foundation there, but the recruitment in the summer has to be better than what it has been so far this season.
Yeah, I wasn't there at the weekend, but I obviously was reading your stuff. One of your main takeaways was Mundle, how bright Mundle was. That's an encouraging start. And like you say, the Jack Clark situation, it would feel more surprising if Clark was a Sunderland player, wouldn't it, come the start of next season, than if it wasn't. Clearly, there has to be a succession plan now for on and off the pitch. I think the beauty with Dodds is there's no settling in period needed. He knows the players inside out. He's been there, and I guess I don't know if this was the case, but if there has been frustrations in the dressing room in recent weeks, then Dodds will have seen that. Dodds will be aware of that, and he'll be able to tap into that, and he'll be able to manage that carefully, won't he? And make sure he gets that balance right. Just on that as well, obviously Dodds was in the coaching team under Mowbray in charge of Birmingham at the weekend. Our thoughts are with Tony, obviously, after the news that came out at the start of this week. I think Tony Mowbray was so popular at Sunderland because not only did he do such a good job with the team, but everyone could see just how much of a brilliant bloke he was and is. How honest he is, and how he got it, didn't he? He got it, and I think that was maybe something with Beale, and it's so hard to explain what that even is, isn't it? But I'm not sure Beale ever did. Mowbray, he's a North East fella. He knows what the football means up here, and he just got it from the off. And we'll join everyone from Sunderland in wishing Tony well, and I'm sure he'll be back in the dugout in no time because he's done a brilliant job at Birmingham so far, isn't he? Which I'm not one bit surprised about, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo Dom's thoughts there. I mean, just on obviously the Tony Mowbray situation, I think there's a bit of a false narrative, isn't there, in the wider media in terms of where Beale's come from because he wasn't from up here. I just think that's a bit of a ridiculous notion, isn't it? You've got Kevin Phillips from outside of the region, who's a club legend. Luke O'Nien currently in the squad, held in such high regard. It's just a bit of a lazy narrative, I think, to put across that the head coach being from somewhere supporters didn't get behind him. Like Gus Poyet, he did a brilliant job when he first came in. It's just such a lazy narrative.
It's just nonsense, isn't it? It's absolute nonsense. That's the so Sunderland fans, I guess, like fans of any club, but Sunderland fans will get behind the player and the team and the manager, and all they want is whoever's representing the club in whatever role it is to show that they care and to show that and Beale did, by the way. I'm not saying he didn't. I'm not saying Beale didn't care. I'm not saying Beale didn't do everything in his power to make a success of things. But yeah, it's absolute nonsense to suggest Sunderland fans weren't having him because he didn't have a North East accent.
I think he did care in terms of that's why you saw him come out fighting, albeit he probably picked the wrong fight, didn't he? Like that he was a man under pressure and that he wanted it to make it work. I think Sunderland supporters wanted it to make it work. Nobody in their right mind supports a football club wanting the person in charge to fail or not to work. That's just not how things work around anywhere, is it? You see plenty of players cross the divide, for example. Managers come from different clubs who you might have had a rivalry with in the past. It's just not the case, is it?
No, and going back to something we touched on at the start, I came away from one or two press conferences with Beale, feeling sorry for him because it must have been difficult in that he comes in, he was on his own, so he didn't bring any of his coaching staff. He was in a hotel for much of the time here, so he's going back to his hotel room on his own, and he's kind of wrapped up in his own thoughts at that time. Now, when you know that you're not particularly popular appointment, the fans aren't having you, for whatever reason. Those must have been difficult times, and that's why I just think it maybe benefits everyone, really. This just an acceptance that this wasn't going to work. It wasn't meant to be. It wasn't going to work. Let's go our separate ways and start again. Best of luck to Beale in whatever comes next, whether that's a manager or a coach or an assistant, whatever it is. Best of luck to him. And whoever replaces him, be it Dodds or whether it's an external appointment, it's a huge job. And there's an awful lot to be optimistic and excited about, isn't there? You look at that squad and the talent that's there and the foundations there. Last season's success, top 6 this year, still obviously is a possibility, but it hasn't been out of reach for much of this season, while really feeling Sunderland haven't been at the best this year, have they? You've never felt like Sunderland are really hitting the stride now, and yet they've always been there. I think this is the hardest the Championship's ever been and ever will be. I can't envisage another campaign like this anytime soon. So you look at next year, even if Sunderland don't make the top 6 this year, there's plenty to build on, isn't there? There's plenty to be encouraged by next season. Now, if it's Dodds, then you've got a real run between now and the summer. If it isn't Dodds, then you would hope that Sunderland's decision makers are gonna have enough time now to make an appointment early in the summer. So then they've got the full summer and the full pre-season, and they're not playing catch up.
Yeah, and it's starting with Swansea, who've won just 1 in their last 5, obviously 18th in the table, a couple of points above the relegation zone. It's a real good platform, isn't it, for Dodds again to go in and pick up 3 points and kickstart his second interim spell this season.
Yeah, it feels like a winnable game, doesn't it? And yet you look back to a really winnable game. But then you look back to when Dodds was previously in charge. The West Brom and the Leeds games were tough games, really tough looking games, and yet he got points out with them, obviously. So yeah, I fancy Sunderland against Swansea. I do.
Yeah, me too. So thanks for joining me this morning, Dom. We'll be back later in the week. Having heard from Mike Dodds' press conference. Thanks for joining us this morning. As I say, We Are Sunderland's live, just £1 for 6 months worth of subscription, and you can